right, guys, this is my last video for the week, I hope. And so I want to talk with you a little bit about the Russian Revolution. And this is a great topic. Hopefully I can do it justice. This would be a fun topic to be talking about with you in class, but that's not going to happen today. So we got about 10 slides to go through to talk about the Russian Revolution. And, you know, it's been a long time since we were talking about revolutions, right? The failed revolutions of 1848, the Greek Revolution in the 1820s. It's been a long time since we talked about those, even those failed revolutions and the fact that Russia didn't have one. But now it's 1917, and it's time for Russia to finally have a revolution. And in this case, it's going to be a successful communist revolution. And this, we want to talk about why they were able to, the communists were able to successfully have a real communist revolution in Russia and create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. So let's talk a little bit about this, right? How do we go from Great Britain, France, and Russia being in the Triple Entente, being allied in order to fight the Germans, and then end up with a Soviet Russia? Well, that's an interesting question, and it has to do a lot with the Russian people and how they handled and felt about World War I. So going back to this slide, remember that Russia faced massive costs in World War I. That's costs in the number of men mobilized, which means that they are not home planting their fields. They are not at work. They are at war, and it's a messy war, and they're not winning. With the number of wounded being extremely high compared to the rest of the world. Of course, Germany pretty close and France pretty close, but the Russian wounded rate extremely high, the number of Russian dead extremely high, the number of Russian missing and prisoners of war. And so this is a bad scene for Russia. And on top of it, Russia is not winning the war. And there were a lot of people in Russia that had had enough. They at first had supported the war for various reasons. Whether you were a person who supported the Tsar, a socialist, a middle-class liberal, and definitely a nationalist, you pretty much supported World War I, supported Russia's entry into World War I, supported it because you believed that it was going to do something for the greatness of Russia, but also that it was going to do something for your socialist or liberal or czarist cause. Certainly it would do something for a national cause. So why did those people turn out to be disappointed with what happened? And why did Russia pull out of the war in the midst of everything and end up having a revolution of its own? Well, let's see if we can get into that right now. All right, so Russia is gonna fall apart, right? World War I provided the spark for this Russian Revolution, or Bolshevik Revolution. We'll be talking about what Bolshevik means in a minute. And Nicholas II was the Tsar who had been dealing with the Duma. Now remember, when Russia was doing its reforms and they were just halfway measures, they didn't even have a Russian parliament. But then they had created the Duma as a result of public pressure, and the Duma itself, they voted for war credits. They voted to support the war. They believed that the war was a good thing. They believed that it would bring Russian nationalism to a greater front. They believed that they were responding to the calls of their Slavic brothers in the Serbian call to war. They believed that they were being leaders in the world. And they believed that maybe some good things, some change would come out of it, and that Russia would get territory, respect, and an increased position in the world. And so at first, the war was supported. But the war wasn't going well. And this meant that Tsar Nicholas decided that a good thing to do would be for him to leave the capital and go out to the battlefield. And here he could lead his armies at the front and show solidarity with the armies, because there was starting to be a negativity, a depression, and anger on the front. And so Nicholas went out there to show his leadership as the Tsar. When he left, however, he left this guy in charge, Rasputin. Rasputin is a crazy, crazy person. I actually am very interested in Rasputin, and I've actually tried 2 different biographies of Rasputin, and haven't made it through them because honestly, his life is quite disturbing. And the biographies that I happened to get from the library, they seem to be a little bit obsessed with certain parts of his life that are less than palatable. And I just didn't want to spend 800 pages reading that. I'd like to know a little bit more about him without it all dwelling on the weirdness that is Rasputin. Very strange man. Grew up strange, grew up believing that he had certain powers or telling people he did, very into the occult, into a lot of weird cultic practices, sexual practices, isolation from others. Rasputin was a weird guy, but he had a certain relationship with the Tsar and the Tsarinas, particularly because he was functioning like a monk in the Russian Orthodox Church, but he was certainly an estranged monk and not the typical norm. But he had gotten the Tsarina to believe that he alone had the power to bring healing and health to her hemophiliac son. And so she believed that if Rasputin wasn't listened to and heeded to, that her son would be likely to die. And so Rasputin had an unfair amount, an unreasonable amount of influence on the Tsarina. And when the Tsar left, Rasputin used that influence to control the Tsarina's decisions. Some people say that Rasputin and the Tsarina were also lovers. That's debated. You can look it up. But this guy did a lot of weird and not very good stuff. And it was so bad that the advisors of the king saw this going on, saw the humiliation to the Tsar's family, and saw the negative things that were going on in St. Petersburg. And so they arranged to have him murdered in December of 1916. Nonetheless, this was not really a great thing for the Russian royal family, and it didn't exactly bring respect of the people. By March of 1917, now the war has been going on for 3 years, and things are really bad in Russia. There are food shortages. There are riots going on in March. That these things turn into the March Revolution, where the soldiers that are in Petrograd actually join the rioters. That's a bad thing. Your soldiers are usually there to put down the rioters. So if they're joining the rioters, that's not so good. The Duma didn't know how to handle this, and so they declared a provisional government in 1917. Now, provisional government is like a government that's there to handle things, in other words, provisionally, for a while. And this new government was put out by the Duma, but the problem is no one trusted it. And when we say no one, we mean 2 groups. We mean, first of all, the liberals who wanted to continue to work with the Duma, and the socialists who didn't want really any of these forms of government at all. And so in May 1917, the acting prime minister of the provisional government, Alexander Kerensky, would refuse to do some things that the socialists wanted him to do. Number one, the socialists expected that any new government that they would approve of would seize all the land from the landholders, and they would distribute it amongst the poor and perhaps even the lower middle class, the working class. And they believed that, of course, this was their socialist dream, and they believed that it would happen because Russia was so badly shaken up. When Kerensky announced that he was not going to confiscate large landholdings and hand them out, but instead he was going to reform Russia but continue the war and continue the war effort, the provisional government fell apart because the socialists were not up for that, and were now far too many of them. They had formed what's called the Petrograd Soviet by 1917. And the Petrograd Soviet was a group of soldiers and of workers, and they actually formed their own shadow government. A shadow government is a government that's not really officially in charge, but the problem is they act as a shadow on any real government, and they start issuing their own orders, having their own elections. And this provisional government, they ordered a famous army order called Army Order Number 1. Let me take myself out so you can see this. Army Order Number 1. And Army Order Number 1, you have to realize the frustration at the front, the frustration with losing, the frustration without supplies, the frustration without weapons. And now you issue an Army Order that says, if you don't like your officer in the field, you as an inferior, you as a enlisted man, you can get together with the other enlisted men in your group, and you can vote out your officer and vote in a new one, including yourself. Can you imagine the disorder that brought to the field? Army Order Number 1 killed any form of organization that Russia had left on that battlefield. And the Petrograd Soviet knew that that's exactly what would happen. And so these guys would vote out their officer, oftentimes string that officer up and kill them in the field, or abandon the field in general. And these soldiers started deserting because there's no one to stop them from doing that. By the summer of 1917, we're in complete anarchy. Officers are being tried and hanged. Soldiers are walking out. They're going home to their fields, but there's no fields to be had. So they're taking what's there. They're squatting. They're fighting people who have moved onto their land. Things are a general mess. And into all of this steps the savior, supposedly, of Russia, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Now, you might hear some people say that Lenin was a really great guy, or the good face of communism in Russia, and then Stalin was really the bad face of communism. I don't know if you've ever heard those arguments. I hope that as we learn about Lenin here very quickly, you'll see that Lenin was, if you call this the good face of communism, well, that's interesting. All right. Lenin, first of all, what was he doing? Why does he have to enter? That sounds like a pretty Russian name. Well, Lenin was a Russian, but he had been thrown out of Russia, exiled out of Russia by the ruling czar at the time, because he had been in support of his brother, who had a plan to assassinate the Tsar way back in 1887. And so this was not a trusted family, and Lenin had become a socialist, and so he was exiled in 1914 for his Marxist ways and for fomenting revolution. And he went to Switzerland, where he could study and learn more about communism. And Lenin developed some ideas about communism in general. These ideas were not peaceful. These ideas were not some kind of agrarian life of shared communes. That wasn't Lenin's idea. By the way, the shared communes idea turns out very violent too. But Lenin's ideas were that if you wanted to overthrow any kind of government and you wanted to have a revolution, it needed to have violence. Okay? Violence was the key. Violence was the way to destroy capitalism. It could not be destroyed peacefully. So from the very beginning, Lenin believed in force, and not just force, but violent force. And so he enters back into Russia. Now, how does he get there? Well, kind of interesting. You know who smuggled him in from Switzerland back into Russia? The Germans. Of course, remember that these are enemies. Okay, the Germans and Russians are fighting World War I against each other, but the Germans make sure that Lenin can get back inside of Russia during this time, and that's because they knew that it would crush any remaining resistance of the Russians and that there'd be an inside disaster going on. So what did Lenin want? He wanted a small, dedicated party of diehards. He said, you know what the problem is with socialism? And guys, he is right about this. Remember how we kept saying that the socialists would divide against themselves? Well, I want, just a workers' pension, or I want a social security system, or I just want better workers' rights, or the peasants. They said, well, we're fine as long as we have our land gains and we're allowed to worship freely. Well, Lenin said, these people are too dumb. We need a die-hard party of people who don't take compromises. We don't need a large-scale rebellion. We just need a few. And so his party was this party of violent, dedicated diehards, and he called them the Bolsheviks, which meant majority group. It's kind of interesting because they weren't the majority group. The Mensheviks were actually the majority group, but nonetheless, Lenin was a master at propaganda, and Trotsky, his friend, even better. We'll learn about him in the next slide. And so they called themselves Majority Group, and they said, we are going to turn Russia into a socialist utopia, blue box utopia. The Mensheviks were a larger group out of the two. Basically, the difference between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks is the speed at which they believe that they can carry out the revolution. The Bolsheviks want this happening now. The Mensheviks are willing to take a slower approach in how any socialist revolution could be had. All right, so by November of 1917, we're in a full-out revolution. November 6, 1917, the Bolsheviks seize all government buildings, and they are able to do this for three reasons. Why? Why is Russia so open to this? Number one, because the place is in anarchy. Food riots, the czars at the front, the family is humiliated, the workers and the soldiers have united together in the cities. Army Order Number 1, people returning from the war. It's an absolute disaster. Number two, Lenin and Trotsky were ultimately determined that they were going to make this happen. Lenin from the political side and Trotsky from the oration side. Trotsky was the speaker. He was the one who would fire up, write the speeches, go out, work the crowds. And so Trotsky was the more radical, at least in his speaking, of the two. And then just war exhaustion. World War I was going horribly, and this seemed like a great answer to Russia's problems. And so we end up with the October Revolution that extends, of course, into November 1917. By that summer, okay, what's part of the revolution? Well, by that summer, there had already been a massive agrarian revolution where the peasants had just been taking land of soldiers that had not returned, of aristocrats that were no longer in position to fight it. The peasants had been taking advantage of the anarchy situation in Russia. And so what Lenin did was just recognize this. He didn't redistribute the land for peasants, but he just said, yes, that which you have, you may keep, and that's compliments of the lovely Bolshevik government. Urban workers had seized the factories. Lenin said, I recognize what you've done. Remember, this was a Marxian principle that we needed to seize the factories, seize the means of production from the hands of the bourgeoisie and give it to the proletariat. And so that happened, and Lenin said, oh, again, wonderful. Bolsheviks were calling themselves communists. By this point, Lenin said, you know what, we're out of the war. We're going to just call it a day. We will sign a separate treaty with the Central Powers. This treaty is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it was a devastating treaty for the Russians. Now, Lenin doesn't really care because his object is not the same object as the Tsar's was or winning World War I was. What Lenin wanted was a communist revolution, and so they lost a third of their population because the area that was given to the Germans and Austro-Hungarians and the Turks through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk took a lot of their very heavily populated areas. The war did continue because word didn't get out that it was completely done. But the communists were controlling the capital now, and Lenin said, for us, this war is over. We're going to work on our communist revolution. We're going to pick back up with this at a later time, but Russia is going to experience some very, very difficult times under Lenin, under his successors, and definitely under Stalin. Russia's going to enter a long period of a lot of difficulty. And yes, they are going to produce mass weapons. They're going to eventually get into a space race. But life for the average Russian doesn't really improve super well, and the loss of freedoms is certainly great. So we're entering a very bloody time in Russian history. Some stuff that wasn't known about until the Soviet Union fell and the vaults were open to documents that could tell the truth about what had been happening since Lenin's takeover of the Soviet Union.